It is a real pleasure tonight, and I've had a little sneak peek. Professor, step right on up. Our speaker tonight comes with 50 years of private experience in the private industry, government experience. He's a professor at the Citadel, Cincinnati, North Carolina. You may know him if you read the Mercury. You certainly know his columns. And of course, I think he's absolutely a genius because his ideas are exactly what I believe in.
And I didn't have to twist his arm.
If you believe in free enterprise and what I consider the bedrock principles of America, then this is a man who understands it and knows it, and from our country and history of our country. He is the president and founder of the Free Enterprise Institute. So, Professor Robert Freer.
Thank you, thank you. It's a great honor. It's a great honor to be here with you this evening. It really is. The fraternal organizations that celebrate the values that are at the core of our nation are those who are at the bridge and are holding that bridge against those forces that would lead us astray, have led us astray. We're in peril, and we do need to come back. And I really appreciate all that you are doing to help that occur. I am charged by the presidents of the 3 adjacent state societies of the Cincinnati to send their regard and to welcome you to Charleston, as they are all here. Very unusual to have you all have your annual meeting and they have 3 associations meeting here all at once. And we'll be in this club tomorrow, celebrating in a way that we really haven't as 3 societies in quite a while. I think that's just great that we do this. And I think it's very important that we celebrate George Washington's birthday as such. This idea that we have that it just really ought to be 3-day weekends, isn't that wonderful? We get another 3-day weekend, has basically totally trashed our history. Lincoln and Washington deserve their own days. They deserve some emphasis on it in schools so that the children understand what it really means to be a descendant of one of those individuals, or to at least understand what it was they did for us. I feel the same way about Memorial Day. I think it's really a shame that we just put these all as part of 3-day holidays. Say something about the title for the speech. I understand someone took a look at it and wanted to know whether or not I was talking about President Obama. One of you all came up and asked whether or not that was the person you were talking about not being in our hearts. Well, I leave that to you. I was actually stealing a title from one of Washington's noted biographers, and let me, without ado, go on. He is in our wallets, but not in our hearts. Now, that was the statement that we have here. I'm not sure that I agree with Richard Brookhiser's oft-quoted descriptions that I took for the title of my remarks tonight. At least in Charleston, we are still basking in the warm glow that came from President Washington's visit to our city in 1791. Charlestonians, I dare say all Carolinians, are a warm and loyal folk. Our hearts are full harmony with those values that General Washington exhibited throughout his adult life. But in many parts of our land, I think that Mr. Brookhiser may be right. George Washington, and my columns in the Charleston Mercury over the years, at once both hopeful and questioning, give pause to ask whether we have abandoned those values that have made our nation a bastion of liberty. And if I don't get this right tonight, Will's going to cut my column. So I have to be real careful that I take care of my editor here. George Washington is not only the father of our country, he is also the father of our morals and values. While he is revered, few today know more than the bare shadow of the man. Serious students wanting to know more must lament that Martha burned their correspondence after his death, leaving us to guess about the most intimate details of their life together. I would judge her act to have been perfectly in accord with his wishes, and we are left with the memories of others and his official acts to judge the man beneath the cloak and the tricorn. UVA has a great program to bring all that correspondence together. They're making great progress on it. And I think we will know a good deal more than we have in the past from these other letters, but we will be denied Martha's and his correspondence, and I'm sure that that was of intent by both of them. By all accounts, Washington sought only to serve his country all the days of his adult life. In fact, one of the major complaints about Washington was that he allowed himself to become so consumed by his public responsibilities that there was little room left for a private personal life. But Washington's commitment to the interests of the country, as he saw them, is unquestioned. No doubt his own words are the best summation of his views of public service. Though I prize, as I ought, the good opinion of my fellow citizens, yet, if I know myself, I would not seek or retain popularity at the expense of our social duty or moral virtue. While doing what my conscience informed me was right, as it respected my God, my country, and myself, I could despise all the party clamor and unjust censure, which must be expected from some whose personal enmity might be occasioned by their hostility to the government. And certain I am, whatsoever I shall be convinced of the good of my country, requires my reputation to be put at risk. Regard for my own fame will not come in competition with an object of much magnitude. So much for the rule against run-on sentences. Felicity of expression was not his forte. Mostly he relied upon those well-educated younger men he attracted his aides to turn his intention into prose. But what we can say is that he was dedicated first, last, and always to what he saw as his duty to the American people. He would bear any price and take on any burden not to let them down. It seemed to Joseph Ellis, author of His Excellency George Washington, that Benjamin Franklin was wiser than Washington, Alexander Hamilton was more brilliant, John Adams was better read, Thomas Jefferson was more intellectually sophisticated, James Madison was more politically astute. Yet each and all of these prominent figures acknowledged that Washington was their unquestioned superior. Ellis also proclaims that within the gallery of greats, so often mythologized and capitalized as founding fathers, Washington was recognized as primus inter pares, the first of them all. How did this come to be? We know the essential chronology of his life. Born to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington, he was a genteel but not noble birth, and left him with the aspirations but not the property of Virginia's first families. His father died when he was 11, and Washington came more directly under the influence of his half-brother Lawrence. And the Fairfax family, their neighbors and the largest landholders in the county, or in the colony, excuse me. His education was only basic grade school, plus surveying, learned in the fields, and such other impressions as he may have gathered of life in Virginia before 1750. He traveled out of the colonies only once, and that was with Lawrence to Barbados in 1751, when Lawrence went there seeking a tropical cure for the tuberculosis that was to take his life not long thereafter. It appears that Washington contracted there a minor case of smallpox that did not leave him greatly disfigured, but did leave him immune to further contraction of that most feared disease during his time in the wilderness and on the campaign trail. In reviewing what we know of these early years, what I find most remarkable is that George Washington was very much a creature of his own construction. Without a father's guidance, he conceived of who he wanted to be and set about methodically as an adolescent to construct himself in that image. His ideal in manners was that of the English gentleman, and he became so dedicated to his achievement, he collected bits and pieces from existing texts on the subject to create his own handbook of manners. Found on the internet today is Washington Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. These rules formed his outside persona to such an extent that throughout his life, his calm demeanor was seldom breached, nor could his inner thoughts be divined. What was also true for Washington was that it transformed his character as well as his outward persona. With Washington, what you saw is what you got. There was little that was spontaneous about his actions from which to judge the inner self. Here are a few of Washington's rules. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. Sleep not when others speak. Sit not when others stand. Speak not when you should hold your peace. Walk not on when others stop. Or how about, show not yourself glad at the misfortune of another, though he were your enemy. I've got a bunch of others here in the written copy of this, which are available to you, but I won't take you and burden you further with reading all of these. It is hard to know why he became so attached to the consistent to a fault approach in his manners and behavior. It hardly seems necessary. His rigid adherence could not have fostered the sense of human connection we seek in those with whom we are friends. Though correct in his behavior, his manner as an adolescent must have seemed standoffish at best. For whom? What? Why was he behaving so priggishly? Is it possible that this young man had any sense of what lay ahead? If not, is it possible that divine forces were molding him for his pivotal role in the creation of our beloved country? Oh, it's left for speculation, but I'd sure like to think so. Of his early years in the military, we know of his time as a military aide to Governor Dinwiddie and his several forays into the wilderness beyond the mountains. We know of his experiencing firsthand the shortcomings of close order drill in wilderness warfare, the prowess of the Indians, and the importance of self-reliance in living to see another day. We also know he suffered the disdain of those very same regular royal officers who had been embarrassed by their defeats west of the Alleghenies. As the 1750s began to lead toward a new decade, now Colonel Washington decided it was time to leave soldiering behind and to find a life partner to help him with the lands he had inherited from Lawrence and take to the proper role as a member of the House of Burgesses. As noted in Joseph Ellis's fine book on George Washington, the woman upon whom his serious intent was focused was Martha Dandridge Custis, probably the wealthiest widow in Virginia, with an inherited estate of 18,000 acres, making her the prized catch of Chesapeake society. Continuing a familial tradition of Washington males of marrying up, Washington began courting her in the spring of 1758. He probably proposed in June. 1 month later, he stood successfully for election in the House of Burgesses for Frederick County. Some scholars suggest that he was secretly in love with Sally Fairfax, wife of George William Fairfax, his best friend. The evidence is scanty, but convincing, that Washington had fallen in love with his best friend's wife several years earlier. Whether he lusted in his heart, to quote former President Carter, excuse me. Oh, you catch that, you understand how that is. These Democrats, I can't keep them straight. Everything we know about his character supports a conclusion that is where it remained, strictly lusted in his heart. Despite any ardor that Sally and young Washington may have shared, the forbidden temptation that Sally represented could not fit into the lofty standards that Washington had established for himself. All evidence points that they were on their best behavior. Whatever he felt towards Sally Fairfax, her husband had been his best friend from childhood. She was a forbidden temptation not permitted to interfere with the careful management of his ascending prospects. Whatever he felt toward Martha Custis, she did fit. Indeed, fit perfectly, and they were married on January 6, 1759. What can be said of his experience as a now very large landowner is that he fell quickly into the trap of most Southern planters of being too dependent on London bankers, and lamented his dependence on someone so far away who created layers of charges for services and costs of materials that did not seem fair. What cannot be said of his fellow land grandees is that he had both the brains and strength to break free from the problem and one of the wealthiest men in America at the onset of the war. What he did was to switch from tobacco as his prime crop to an assortment of locally sold crops, fish, and services for his fellow Virginians. Among those services was one of the first distilleries in America, and he was a very successful producer of alcohol, making $7,500 from 11,000 gallons in the second or third year of its use here. There's going to be a fine article in the Mercury on this next week, which I hope you all will go look up and read. It was during this period that his resentment grew more intense against the inconsistent and heavy-handed actions of the Crown in its administration of colonial lands. His earlier resentment at the snubs felt in the military from royal officers became more fixed as a result of royal decrees setting all the lands beyond the Alleghenies as reserved for royal disposition. This took from him the thousands of acres he had accumulated during his military service and ingrained the notion that while he considered himself an Englishman, the Crown considered all colonists pawns to be moved about and disposed of as the Crown decreed. They, like their flocks and herds, were mere chattel. With the imposition of the Stamp Act and later the tea tax, there opened up for him new vistas in his consideration of where his duty lay in his service to Virginia. Letters whisked up and down the coast between those becoming leaders in the bubbling cauldron of colonial discontent. It soon hardened into open opposition, became insurrection, and ultimately into the birth of the American Republic. Growing respect for the sagacity of Washington's farm management, his quiet but serious pursuit of his duties as a member of the House of Burgesses, and ultimately his growing conviction that only colonists could govern themselves, drew the attention of his fellow legislators, and with it his leadership role grew. After years of English vacillation, the imposition of 1774 of the Intolerable Acts, closing the port of Boston and asserting martial law over the colonies, was the final straw. George Washington was the third of 7 delegates from Virginia to the First Continental Congress. It was said at the time that Henry would say the magnificent things, whereas Washington could be counted on to say little, but do the right thing. Washington wrote to his friend George Fairfax in London that the cause of Boston must ever be the cause of America. There is after this, despite the many twists and turns and obsequious behavior by the legislatures of Pennsylvania and several other colonies, a feeling that the breach could not be solved short of war. Certainly after Lexington and Concord, George Washington felt the Crown would not be satisfied without a thrashing of the colonists and the colonies involved. The Crown's imperial goals were inconsistent with the aspirations of this side of the Atlantic. The needs of what were beginning to be called Americans and the needs of a remote empire were incompatible. As in the other colonies, the period between the First and Second Congresses was filled with frantic activity to put the colonies into a defensive posture. In Virginia, George Washington was the choice by acclamation to lead their forces, and in truth was the only real choice to lead the non-existent Continental Army to oppose the force on its way to subject the colonists. His military stature, bearing, and lifetime of both looking and acting the part made his selection all but certain. I would be preaching to the choir for this audience to go through General Washington's early experiences leading the Army. Let's just say he found the most unlikely generals from a Boston bookstore and a Rhode Island Quaker, as well as a coterie of usual suspects that had fought in the French and Indian War and had cast their lot with the colonists. George made his share of mistakes, the greatest being his taking on the Redcoats in Manhattan and escaping by the dint of Yankee ingenuity and the superhuman dedication of Colonel Putnam's barge evacuation to the Jersey shore. It can be said that it wasn't until the Trenton miracle that General Washington came into his own by pulling off the impossible crossing the Delaware in a storm with his battered and weary soldiers to catch the Hessians unaware, and following that up with a victory at Princeton that made it clear to those in London that this army just wasn't going to fade away. Throughout this period, the myth of Washington grew, whether it is George Washington using the flat of his sword at the Battle of New York to pursue fleeing Continentals, or being in the first boat to cross the Delaware in a snowstorm, he shared his troops' privation and risk while maintaining his leadership reserve. It was his steadfastness and leadership from the front of the line that won the hearts of his troops. Following the Battle of Princeton, there were many reverses for the Continentals, but Washington always managed to avoid a crushing blow while bleeding an enemy at the end of a very long supply line that was more concerned with Europe and the French than America. While there were forces in Congress that wanted his replacement, there was little agreement on anyone who could do better, and General Washington's open willingness to retire to his farm, if asked, created a cry among the troops that soon stilled any of the cabals for his removal. In truth, George Washington had become, for the rest of the world, synonymous with the Revolution. His strict personal integrity and aloofness soon raised him to the status of a demigod. That role fit him like a glove and became the cement holding the sometimes frail bonds of union from dissolving entirely. He defended his new title of His Excellency and General from whatever attack was leveled. His response to General Gage, who refused to recognize it as classic. You affect, sir, to despise all rank not derived from the same source with your own. I cannot conceive any more honorable than that which flows from the uncorrupted choice of a brave and free people, the purest source and original fountain of all power. By the time of winter camp at Valley Forge, Washington had become a living symbol of the values of the Revolution. His very doggedness inspired his troops and eventually provided, along with his few clear victories that his troops were able to win in the field, were enough to win the support of France to openly cast its lot with America and make final victory but a waiting game. Perhaps his finest hour came in 1783 as the victorious troops in winter camp across from West Point openly prepared to march on Congress to demand his elevation to kingly status. Like Cincinnatus, his character prevailed as he faced them, pulled spectacles for the first time from his waistcoat. Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country. The speech itself was the finest that he ever wrote, but he had his audience at the first reached for the unfamiliar glasses, and the effort to elevate him was stopped in its tracks. Washington did resign his commission before Congress, sitting in Annapolis, and returned to Mount Vernon, fully content to remain there, leading the life of a Virginia planter. But as we know, he was not going to be allowed to remain in retirement. The people for whom he had sacrificed his every breath would again call him to properly launch a new republic 6 years thereafter that embodied many of the lessons he had learned in winning its right to exist. Thank you. My expertise is as much in national policy creation as it is in the history of George Washington or in the business subjects that I teach at the Citadel. And I would be glad to take any questions on any of the subjects I've written on in the 130 columns that have been coming your way now for over 5 years. If you have any questions either on the speech, on George, or on my columns, I'm happy to answer them. You know it all. Oh, wait, I have a question over here.
You know an awful lot about him. Do you know where his family's from?
Sulgrave Manor, and I believe it's Kent, but I'm not sure. Roberta?
France.
Hmm?
France. He's a Huguenot.
Oh, you're saying Washington was a Huguenot?
Yes.
Well, they do have a place in England called Sulgrave Manor, which essentially is
A place called the Wash, and the name of the little town there, Washington, but the family name was Martu. And they changed it because the elder Martu said, what should we do with our name now that we're living in England, getting away from this Roman Catholic situation? And, persecution. And one of them said, if we're living in the Wash, let's call ourselves Washington.
well. That's very. I had not heard that story. That's terrific.
That's a true story. I'm one of the guys at the Huguenot Church, I'm also a member.
Well, I appreciate that knowledge.
I didn't just know that.
I will tuck it away to. I will tuck it away to spring on somebody else.
I just thought I thought you'd enjoy that.
I do enjoy it. Thank you,
I enjoyed the result too.
sir.
There is a story that I read sometime ago that they arrived by his grandfather actually taking French leave. That ship that he had arrived on needed some work, and when it sailed, he didn't. Do you know that to be a fact?
I don't know that to be a fact, but I defer to the expertise in this room. Mine is a studied expertise where you all really have lived this for many years in terms of your interest in digging away at it every year. Any other questions?
Did Washington have many problems with his cabinet, with them having different views?
Oh, he did. He did indeed. Very interesting too, because they really modeled the problems he had during the period of time that he was commander in chief, and a lot of the reviews that he had really came from that time. People blamed them on Hamilton, but no, this was Washington. He felt that you really did need to have a strong executive because he'd had all this problem with Congress in terms of getting them to do anything. Then he had to deal with the various states, which at that point really were independent states. and trying to get them to do anything in terms of supporting the army that was just falling apart. So he really saw the necessity for having a strong central government. He felt that way long before either Annapolis or Philadelphia. So yes, indeed, he did have problems. And there was really an open cabal by the time that the decision to take on the debts of the states was bargained out in exchange for Washington being the capital and moving it from Philadelphia. The people in Philadelphia never felt it was going to happen. Who in heaven's name could believe they were going to create a capital out of a swamp? But by gosh, they did. Well, I guess I've exhausted questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was informative and entertaining, and we appreciate you being here this evening.